Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It's time to talk about the deep space updates. I got a whole batch of things that went on that's worth talking about, and of course, we're going to start with the launches. And I think one of the more interesting launches of this interval, let's say, was on the 11th when there was a Starlink launch. And of course, we get a lot of Starlink launches. They're usually not that interesting, but this one, well, it was special for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was the 14th flight or reuse of a booster, which is a first time that they've managed to cross that threshold. But this was Group 4-2, and there was only 34 Starlink satellites on it because this was a rideshare, and the other payload was way bigger and more complicated than any other rideshare payload they've carried on Starlink. It was the Blue Walker 3. This is a 1.5-ton satellite which is supposed to provide cell phone service to regular handsets, right? Now, this is just a test satellite, but this has a monster phased array antenna. It's supposed to unfold to 65 square meters or thereabouts, 700 square feet. This is huge. I mean, you see the photo of this thing. I have no idea what this will look like, but if it catches the light, it could be quite an impressive flare. I mean, although to be fair, the area of this antenna is still smaller than the area of the solar panels on the space station. Anyway, yeah, this is currently a test launch. They have, the rights. They've got partnerships around the world to test it. Apparently, there will be tests in Texas and Hawaii, but it's not going to be a production device anytime soon. It's also worth noting that in around the same time, Link Global actually have got FCC approval and licenses to deliver cell phone service from their satellites, but of course they're going to have to start launching those. Okay, on the 12th, worth noting there was a new Shepard launch, which did not go according to plan. I already made a video about that. I will tell you a little more about that in a bit, but let's talk about the other launches. On the 13th of September, there was a Long March 7A. We don't usually get those, but this was launching a satellite into geostationary orbit. Now, the satellite was ChinaSat 1E, and while many of the ChinaSat spacecraft are known to be commercial spacecraft, the ChinaSat 1A through E, they never tell us anything about it, so it's generally presumed that these are military communication satellites of some sort, but we don't know a whole lot more. On the 15th, Rocket Lab launched an Electron carrying a spacecraft for Inspective. This was the Owl spreads its wings. It's the second of 3 launches for Inspective carrying their Strix spacecraft that do synthetic aperture radar. That's what this company does. On the 19th, there was another Falcon 9 carrying a batch of 54 Starlink satellites. It was Group 4-34. Yeah, this one just kept on being delayed by weather, but it eventually went. On the 20th, we had Long March 2D carrying the Yunhai 103 weather satellite that was launching into sun-synchronous orbit. And just yesterday, on the 21st, we had the Soyuz MS-22 launching from Baikonur. This is carrying 3 new crew to the International Space Station. We have the Russian Sergei Prokopfiev and Dmitry Petelin, and from NASA we have Frank Rubio. This was a launch which was particularly spectacular. It launched close to dawn or close to sunset, whatever. It was a twilight launch. And there's some amazing photos off the ground showing the vapor trail, but more interestingly, or more spectacularly, on the space station, Samantha Cristoforetti got these amazing photos showing the launch from space. So that's already docked at the International Space Station. I expect that MS-21 will be returning in a week or so. That has 3 Russian astronauts. Yeah, so that's the launches right now. Now, back to that Blue Origin New Shepard failure. We haven't really heard anything more, nor did we expect much more. To be honest, Blue Origin, rather secretive company. We have, however, seen satellite images provided by Harry Stranger, who basically found an impact scar, right? This is like a visible circular mark on the soil, possibly as big as 60 meters, right? So We knew that by the point it had the failure, it would have probably burned about half of its propellant, but that meant that half of the propellant fell back to the ground. There was probably a fairly violent explosion. Probably not a fire though, and an explosion isn't actually as bad as a fire. Fire tends to destroy things, explosion just tends to spread the bits out. So there's probably a lot of stuff for them to look at and to try to figure out why the engine failed. They may already know. Some of the experiments have been returned to the various teams. One of them posted to LinkedIn saying that their experiment had been returned. It was intact. It looked good, considering that it had experienced 15 Gs. Since then, that post has been removed, but 15 Gs seems way higher than what we saw for it. We're not really sure if that's from the initial acceleration off, or from an landing that was rough, or from deceleration due to being transonic. Anyway, we're hoping to find out more at some point, but yeah, it was also confirmed that there is one other booster. So the booster that they were using was the older one, and they were reserving it mainly for the science experiments. The newer one is the one that gets to carry passengers. So yeah. Also, a couple of days ago, we had Rocket Lab do their big investor day. That meant we got to find out some new details about Neutron. So also, I guess actually it was worth pointing out that the Rocket Lab, since they went public essentially by the SPAC acquisition thing, they have used that money, that war chest, to buy up a number of different companies that are working in the space. And I think it was Peter Beck that basically said, well, now we're really more Space Lab rather than Rocket Lab. They have, end-to-end services. But yeah, we were most interested in Neutron. And they've changed a bunch, right? Now they've gone from 7 engines to 9 engines on that first stage, but they've reduced the thrust on the engines. They've changed the fairings down from a 4-part fairing to a 2-part fairing. The engine design has changed, and it's now going to use oxidizer-rich closed-cycle staged combustion. Previously, they were going to use a gas generator, and Peter Beck sort of gave this explanation, which comes down to if they were trying to get the performance they needed and the temperatures they needed so they could make the engine reusable, they were having trouble also getting the throttle variability in there. So they're now going with a more complex staged combustion design. And that is very ambitious, given that Rocket Lab have only previously built electrically pumped engines. But, they say they're hoping to do, prime tests before the end of the year? So not prime test, they're hoping to at least test the pre-burners, presumably before the end of the year, and engine tests before the end of next year. I won't be surprised if this pushes back Neutron. But other than that, it looked like they've made some fairly sensible changes to Neutron. It also came up that they've contracted with NASA to get a new testing facility at Stennis. And this is the A3 test stand, which was apparently originally built for the J2X program. But funny thing is, the J2X program never got as far as needing this test stand. However, the bill that basically approved the construction of the SLS, the local senator down there, Roger Wicker, basically insisted that NASA complete construction of this, even though there was going to be nothing to actually test on it. And a decade later, now there's actually something to test on it. Yeah. So they also clarified the Neutron, or they've now basically said that customers are interested in using Neutron in expendable mode, where it will have a 15-ton capability. And if they could do barge recovery, that would be a 13-ton capability, but they would prefer to use it at its 8-ton limit, where they can just return to the launch site and recycle the thing. Okay, so the other really big launch, which hasn't happened yet, of course, is SLS. And, well, yesterday we had the huge fueling test where they wanted to do another wet dress rehearsal after repairing some ground service equipment, changing out mounting plates, to try to see if they could actually fuel SLS with its hydrogen gas that just really wants to leak out through every possible gap. And apparently they eventually succeeded. And I say eventually because there was a lot of finagling of things, trying to fuel at higher pressures, lower pressures, trying to heat things up, cool things down. They eventually managed to fill up SLS, the booster, completely. And they tweeted out that they have achieved all their objectives for this. And by the sound of things, they think that September 27th may actually be a serious chance of the launch attempt. If so, watch this space. If not, I won't be surprised if it ends up getting rolled back for some more stuff. In deep space, as part of the Artemis program, Capstone has been having some troubles. Basically, after they made their third trajectory correction maneuver on September 8th, the vehicle or the spacecraft went into a spin, and it took them 24 hours to get back in contact. By the time they did that, the vehicle or the spacecraft was it wasn't getting enough power, and its propulsion system was cooling down. So using the deep space network, using the biggest dishes, they have been able to contact it, command it. They have essentially, what they're trying to do is bring the propulsion system online so they can cancel out the spin. The problem is the spin is orienting the solar panels in a manner which means they don't get the amount of power that they want. And because they're not getting the power they want, they're having a hard time heating up the propulsion system. And the propulsion system uses hydrazine, which has a freezing point of about 2 degrees Celsius. So they've been trying to balance this, to heat up the propulsion without consuming all the power and forcing the spacecraft to go through a restart. It sounds like they're very close at this time, but not quite yet. Firefly had a couple of launch attempts in the last couple of weeks. So their first attempt was Sunday a couple of weeks ago, and they basically counted all the way down to 1 minute before their launch, and then they aborted. And then they spent the rest of their launch window trying to troubleshoot this problem, and eventually gave up and scrubbed for the day. The next day, the weather just didn't cooperate, so they scrubbed that completely. According to Firefly, their next launch attempt is going to be September 30th, and it's going to be about from midnight till 2 a.m. Pacific time. So yeah, I get a busy week next week. Good news for Firefly, by the way, is that NASA has added them to their Vader program. That's the venture class acquisition of dedicated or rideshare launch. And they are the only provider that's considered in the 500 kilogram to 1,000 kilogram class. So if they want a dedicated launch for a satellite of that mass, Firefly's in a good position for that. Stratolaunch today just showed off a really cool photo of their vehicle separation system. Now the thing is, okay, Stratolaunch, they're not really about space anymore. They're about hypersonics, but I still think it's cool to see this photo showing, all these explosive bolts firing. That's pretty neat. Spin Launch, another highly experimental company. They've raised $71 million from people who think there might be a chance of this thing working. I'm still highly skeptical, but I still do think that for their launch thing, they are doing the right stuff. It'll be interesting to see if they can make this work, but it looks like Spin Launch will continue to develop and scale up their hardware. OneWeb they're getting ready to launch a new batch of satellites. They've shipped a bunch to India, so they're currently integrating. They're going to be launching on India. I think it must be the PSLV, but I could be wrong. In other international spacefaring news, Axiom 2 is going to have 2 astronauts from Saudi Arabia. And I heard that and I immediately said, well, wait a second. Isn't that mission going to be commanded by Peggy Whitson? And so, of course, I began to make jokes about, Saudi Arabia and women drivers. And I actually then realized that, to their credit, apparently these 2 Saudi astronauts will include a woman. So, yeah, good on that. Also, in the last week or so, Turkey signed a deal with Axiom to launch a Turkish astronaut. Yeah, so that's going to happen. NASA, over the last couple of weeks, they've been looking for new proposals for future private astronaut missions. So they're wanting to have 2 missions per year to the International Space Station to allow industry partners to, get experience with potential future private operated space stations, right? NASA, by the way, they have, like, I know that Axiom's been applying, but they're looking for other options, right? Because they don't want everything to be space tourism. Um, it is interesting, apparently, that the language that NASA presented specifically says that proposed missions seeking to conduct a spacewalk by a private astronaut will not be considered allowable. So if you want to do a spacewalk, then Polaris Dawn is the way to go. That is still in the offing. There's been a lot of cool videos recently, taking all sorts of cool people in the back seat of the planes. But they have shifted the potential launch date of Polaris Dawn into early 2023 at this point. Okay, down in Boca Chica, we got 7 engines firing on booster number 7, and that was apparently enough of a success that they're switching it out with booster number 8, which is going to do some testing. Booster 7 has been rolled back to the high bay to do some more work to make it more robust. And it sounds like when that comes back to the launch site, they're planning to do a full 33 engine test fire and, at some point possibly a launch. We've also seen the water deluge system at the launch site actually activate, and that will probably help a whole lot. They will probably need it when they are firing 33 engines. In other SpaceX news, Starlink apparently turned on its first site, its first base station in Antarctica, so it now has service on all 7 continents. And they also demonstrated 100 megabit connectivity for an in-flight, for an aircraft in flight, and that's of course one of the deals they're pursuing. So yeah, that's all the stuff that I've got for you right now. I actually have to get in a car and drive down to Vandenberg because on Saturday we have the very last Delta IV, right? The last Delta IV Heavy launching from the West Coast. That is the biggest rocket that has ever launched from the West Coast, and I'm going to be there 3 miles from it, freaking out. Also, on Monday the 26th, the DART mission, that is going to be meeting its end as it crashes into asteroid Dimorphos and hopefully changes its orbit in a very cool and scientifically interested manner. So yeah, there's a lot to pay attention to right now. I hope you enjoyed the news. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.